So welcome back. This week, we're speaking again with Mr. Brunello Rosa, who's the CEO of Rosa and Rubini Associates. And it's been a very active week in European politics. Today, we're looking at the results of the Italian presidential election and the future of Europe as a construct. So Brunello, Mattarella was reelected as Italy's president this weekend. And just from a bird's eye view, what can we expect in terms of continuity in the Italian political system, do you think?
Yes, Mattarella was re-elected president. It is clearly something that he wasn't looking for, but it happened. Parties were unable to agree on a name that would make everybody happy, and somehow the default solution was trying again and see whether Mattarella would be available for a second mandate. Something happened after 7 inconclusive ballots. It's unfortunately the second time this happens in Italian politics. First time was with Napolitano in 2013. And what Mattarella wanted to avoid was that the re-election of the president became kind of the norm instead of being somehow the exception. But here is where we are, and clearly this is a solution that makes markets very happy because the institutional continuity is guaranteed for at least another year until the 2023 elections, with Draghi remaining at Palazzo Chigi. Clearly, after that, all bets are off. Who's going to win the election, what government we are going to have, and whether Mattarella will stay on for the entire 7 years or it will eventually resigned as Napolitano did after 2 years.
I think it's important to note that, Mattarella only found unanimous support with the grand electors after 7 inconclusive ballots, when sort of political tensions and in corporate circles and others are really just sort of rising. I mean, what does this tell us about the fragmentation of the Italian political system? And how do you think Mattarella as president, as well as Draghi continuing to be prime minister, will adapt to this environment?
Well, it clearly shows that the political system in Italy is very ineffective, and is ineffective also because it's fragmented. As I said in our previous podcast, we had 4 parties between 15 and 20%, maybe 16 and 21% of support. And after these elections, the support for some parties have diminished further in that kind of range, and nobody has actually increased support, which really tells you how problematic it is to pass things through parliament when no party is big enough to command a solid majority, even for the most basic duty of a parliament, with the inclusion of a regional representative, which is the election of the top job in Italy, the head of state. So clearly for Draghi now, a difficult period begins because he will have to make sure that compromises are reached within the majority ahead of the elections and cross vetoes do not prevail.
Exactly. And lots of people might look at that and say, hey, we're merely just sort of kicking the can down the road. And even though we've reached some semblance of political stability right now, we know that the country's next parliamentary elections are in 2023, and they're going to be the ones that decide the future of Italy's institutional setting. I'm wondering, Brunello, would you have any early predictions for what happens then?
It's very hard to say because, as I said, there are 4 major parties, which are all polling between 15 and 20% max. And some of them are losing further support, such as Lega. Others are stable at best, such as the PD. Forza Italia's consent is collapsed recently, and will not fare anywhere near what it did in 2018. And clearly, Fratelli d'Italia has been increasing a lot, but is far from having enough support to be able to be the center of the next center-right coalition. So There is a risk that next parliament will be as fragmented as the current one, and the new grand coalition, so to speak, will have to be formed. And that's the hope of people like Matteo Renzi, who hope that effectively Draghi can remain in place also after the next election by continue commanding a sort of centrist rassemblement that in parliament is formed to support the action of his future government, which might be slightly more political than the current one.
Mm. And I think it's also worth zooming out a bit, because the reason we're really so worried about Italy's presidential election is because it contributes to the broader resilience of, the European project. And I think you mentioned the three elections, that we really have to watch are Italy, Germany, France. And I kind of want to go back to the German election, because what we achieved there is a sort of quite broad-based, some people call it a traffic light coalition. With the results we see there, do you think we've effectively kind of achieved German support for the European project? Have we mitigated that risk, would you say, Brunello?
Yes, as you said, we identified these three elections between 21 and 22 as the key elections for the European integration process. The German election went somehow better than expected in terms of actual outcome, but in terms of result itself also provided a very fragmented parliament with lots of much smaller parties, including the CDU, which reached the smaller result in its history, and only because a kind of a heterogeneous coalition between the liberals, the SPD, and the Greens emerged, that Germany managed to have a government after a couple of months from the elections. This government is clearly pro-European, which is good news for the European project. It's also a government that's clearly Atlanticist, so it reassures all the allies about the international position of Germany. Italy's election we just discussed, we kicked the can down the road for the next year or so. Is kind of an easier ride than it could have been if somebody else have prevailed, but we have just postponed the problem of finding a final institutional setting, definitive institutional setting for Italy for a few more months. And these months are crucial because this is when the Growth and Stability Pact will be rediscussed. And it's true that Draghi and Macron form a strong duo for the reform of the pact, but then the Germans, even under the SPD rule, will not totally trust Italy on its finances until it's known what this final or kind of more definite institutional setting is. They will always fear the new populist parties or the existing populist parties will come to the fore and make Italy's fiscal position difficult to manage in the future. Hence now all the eyes are on France and elections that are coming up in April 2022.
Let's talk about France sort of a bit more deeply as well, because what we see here is Macron still kind of firm, leading in the polls. We see kind of a moderate, still alternative to Macron, Valérie Pécresse, who's currently, I think, polling fourth. But in the middle, we see Eric Zemmour, we see Le Pen. And so these are the two candidates, I feel, that could really destabilize kind of France's allegiance to, a European integration. But you've said sort of, this remains relatively a moderate to low risk. Tell me a bit more about
that. So until recently, it seemed kind of obvious that Macron will win again the election, again in a runoff with Marine Le Pen, as it happened in 2017. However, now with the emergence of Valérie Pécresse as the leader of the Républicains, then things are becoming a bit more uncertain. She might not be able to challenge Macron for the presidency, but there are good chances that the Republicans will fare well in the June parliamentary elections. And we know that in spite of being a presidential system, is still a semi-presidential system. The prime minister counts and parliament counts and needs to provide the vote of confidence to the government. So if a parliamentary majority is in favor of a different prime minister from that coming from the president's party, well, that's it. It's the so-called cohabitation. So Macron might be forced to cohabitation with potentially Pécresse if the Republicans do well in the next parliamentary election. Having said that, that's a duo that will still relatively reassuring in terms of France's commitment to Europe compared to the possibility of Le Pen or let alone Eric Zemmour becoming president and effectively revolutionize the entire system. These are risk scenarios at the moment, but it's worth looking at because the aftermath of the pandemic can still be quite problematic in a number of countries, especially from an economic perspective, even if the healthcare situation has clearly improved and will improve further in coming months.
So I think the bottom line is in the German situation, in the Italian situation, we've achieved sort of short-term political stability, but we can't be complacent. We've got to look out for what happens in France in a couple of weeks. So I'm sure that'll, keep us active. Brunello, thank you so much for your time and insight as always. Super useful.
Thank you very much. We'll speak again soon.